Okay. Hello, this is the CUDAN OLS seminar on March 23, 2026. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Eva Cetinic from the University of Zurich, Institute of Art History. And she will speak about a decade of AI, artificial intelligence, in the interpretation and creation of art. And without further ado, Eva, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everybody for joining. Yes, so the topic of my talk today is a decade, or perhaps a little bit longer, of AI and interpretation and creation of art. And the idea of this talk is to basically go through some major changes or kind of briefly reflect on the evolution of this intersection of AI and art, and to kind of keep it grounded in my own personal experience of basically working in that field. Or, I mean, this whole subsection of AI and art is, of course, a very broad field, and I will not talk about all of the aspects today, but mainly some of them. So I would like to first just introduce myself, give a little bit of background of who I am and what is kind of my scientific background. I basically have a PhD in computer science, and I was working mainly in computer vision on topics related to the kind of computational analysis of digitized artworks, which I kind of started working on back in 2012. I did several postdocs, and I ended up now at the University of Zurich, where I'm currently leading a research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation called the Canon of Latent Spaces: How Large AI Models Encode Art and Culture. And well, this is an ongoing project. We're now entering the third year. It's a 4-year long project. We're 3 people, myself and 2 other PhD students. And essentially our goal, our focus is really to explore various aspects of contemporary generative foundational multimodal models and how they relate to different aspects, how they, let's say, encode, right, notions of art and culture, but also how the culture of use of these models is changing. If you want to know more about the project itself, this is the website. Here we have a list of activities and publications. But so essentially, this is, let's say, the broad question that preoccupies my current research, right? How large AI models encode art and culture. But I would like to go back in when I kind of started my PhD, when I started this whole journey. What was the question back then, right? I mean, there were many questions, but one that could kind of summarize the initial approach to this field was something like, can computers learn to recognize art? And I'm deliberately using the word computers because it kind of corresponds a little bit to the narrative of that time. It was a pre-AI, pre-deep learning period in which essentially this kind of question actually posed a challenge, right? Something that was back then quite difficult to achieve by recognizing, I mean, building, let's say, a model or a method in which you can have a painting by any kind of artist be automatically recognized as belonging to that artist or to a particular period, right? That's something that later on reflects into this task of classification, right? Why I actually wanted to work in this field was, well, I wanted to work with data that I considered to be nice and inspiring. And I also wanted to work on something that is not necessarily practical, right? Because applying computational methods in art, there is not necessarily a very practical question that needs to be solved, right? There it's not like about, I don't know, automatic vehicles or medical imaging, you know, where you have something very concrete in computer vision. Art presented something something different, something where we can actually try to see essentially what are the interesting questions in a more subtle and nuanced domain where we encounter types of images that are not the typical ones in this field. And another thing that kind of motivated me was basically also the very fact that something that is an artwork, right, a physical object, a painting, a drawing, whatever, went through this process of digitization, right, and it became it became essentially a collection of numbers, right? So you have this physical object that has a lot of layers of interpretation, a lot of knowledge that is already assigned to it, a lot of interpretation that is already assigned to it in the field of art history, but also subjective. So it's a kind of, let's say, a complex object that now all of a sudden becomes just a collection of numbers, right? So of course there is something that is obviously lost in this transformation, but my idea, my kind of let's say motivation of even going into that direction was is there something that is gained, just from the perspective of having something that is essentially not of a quantitative nature, of having it now expressed in numbers, right? What can we do something interesting with it, just by starting from that very transformation. And essentially my motivation was also to kind of measure complex high-level image features, something that at the time seemed challenging. And the idea was not in, let's say, it was not grounded in a kind of idea that everything can be measured, but on the contrary, it was grounded on the idea that there are things that cannot be measured. And that actually my aim was to explore these limits, right? How far can we go and what stays beyond, right, of the realm of being addressed and tackled with computational methods. At that time, also my idea was that I would approach this field by coming up with some kind of intelligent metric, right, that I would have to come up with some measurement of style by focusing on these very low-level image features, on focusing on colors and textures and all of these aspects of images. And that I would have to, let's say, model some metric that would be meaningful, right? That would, of course, not be absolute or that would be, of course, an approximation, but essentially it was a kind of intellectual challenge, right? Because it meant going deeper into the computational representation of images, but also into the kind of representation of what is style and how we can transform and translate these things. And just to give a little bit of context let's say, in terms of data sets and models, one of the first papers that I published based on this topic was something where I basically used a small data set that I assembled myself of 500 artwork images that I found online with the most common Western-centric famous artist names, Dali, Picasso, and so on, right? And used various different image features to get some kind of accuracy of 75%, right? So this was a kind of typical approach before the deep learning era, in which essentially this representation of images was a way of images were represented in a kind of form of various types of features, some of them addressing, notions of color or texture or various different aspects. And so the focus was on the image itself, and the motivation was to kind of measure a complex, high-level type of metric or feature based from these very low-level statistical properties of images to kind of come up with something like that. But in the meantime, when I kind of started working on this question, the field itself started to really radically change with the introduction of convolutional neural networks, right? Which represent a kind of complex layered representation of images, right? These convolutional neural networks basically changed the field of computer vision, and because of course they were much better in trying or extracting a kind of representation of images than the previous features. And why it was even to get into this direction of deep neural network models was because of also large data sets that emerged at the time. The most famous one was the ImageNet that many of you might have heard of, which is a collection of various images of various objects labeled by many people, and it became a kind of foundational data set of computer vision in the previous decade, right? And so essentially this approach of modeling, of coming up with an intelligent metric was became, let's say, obsolete, because the type of representations that you could extract from neural networks, these so-called embeddings, essentially performed better than all other features, right? Because the whole idea was, if you have an artwork, a painting, whatever kind of image, and now it exists as a collection of numbers, the whole point is to transform this initial collection of numbers into a different type of collection of numbers, into a descriptor, right, in a kind of more meaningful way. And so the approach was, when I started working in this field, it was initially, the idea was to kind of handcraft these features, right, to come up with some kind of interesting metric. And eventually it became obvious that neural networks can do these things much better, right? So that these transformations actually happen through neural networks that are trained on lots of data, right? So essentially this notion of the embedding became the dominant image descriptor. And in this case, we do not really, let's say, fully understand what is happening. You kind of know that these embeddings are related to the type of data set that the network was trained on. And we do understand that a certain notion of semantic similarity is preserved, because if we use it as an extractor, as a description of images, and project it into the kind of latent space, feature space, the semantic similarity was preserved on a level that was not possible to do it previously, right, with those low-level features. So not only were these convolutional neural network-based descriptors performing better than other features, also this was a time around 2015, 16, 17 that also large art data sets started to emerge, right? Something like wiki art, usually not data sets that were not necessarily curated by institutions, but that were easy to, let's say, scrap and get a kind of large collection of artwork images. So essentially, when I started working, I had, as I said, a small data set of 500 images, and then just a few years later, I scrapped WikiArt, and there was 130,000 of images. So all of this, the whole direction of the field was basically changing, in a sense that what was essentially interesting in this first question, right? Can computers recognize art? This is a question that transformed into the field of classification, and a lot of papers. I mean, it was still in computer vision quite a niche subfield, but a lot of papers were published, and essentially the whole field started to resemble a sort of, okay, we have this data set and we use this model and we get this level of accuracy, or we use a little bit of a bigger data set and we have another, or we tweak this model, or we have a little bit of a different setting and then we get a little bit of a higher accuracy, right? So it kind of lost its meaning, or at least to me, it lost its appeal of this really initial intellectual curiosity, in which the essential idea was to kind of come up with some kind of measurement, right, of something that you actually had to figure out yourself, right, how to model a high-level feature. Now it was basically, okay, I use this model, I have this pipeline, I can try to experiment with different parameters, but essentially this kind of intellectual labor was lost, right? It was all the neural network doing the describing of the image in a more or less effective way. And of course, this was also a time that I realized in a kind of need to make this type of research more interdisciplinary grounded, because this is essentially, computer vision using art data sets to experiment with different approaches. But what was the type of perspective that different fields had on this kind of analysis, right? So essentially, in when I would present my work on classification and art recognition and computer vision-based conferences, I would always have a kind of positive, more or less positive outlook, almost like a kind of surprise. Oh, you can actually do this on paintings. Oh, wow! It was this kind of something, kind of a nice thing, right? A kind of more positive perspective. Of course, if when I would present it in more interdisciplinary venues with art historians and humanities scholars, they would be much more critical. And they would be critical to a point where it also, it started kind of, the work that I was doing seemed to somehow absurd, right? It became almost like ridiculous because essentially it meant measuring something that is not measurable. And there was a Monty Python sketch that I watched a few years ago that kind of very much summarized how I felt showing these things to to humanities scholars, right? And I can perhaps play it briefly here. Let me just check if you can hear it.
Schopenhauer was a philosopher. Oh, yeah. He's the one that begins with an S. Like a Nietzsche. Does Nietzsche begin with an S? There's an S in Nietzsche. Oh, wow, yes, there is. Do all philosophers have an S in them? Yeah, I think most of them do.
So after watching this sketch a few years ago, I felt like this is exactly what I'm doing. I'm just like showing the kind of art historian equivalent. There is an S in Nietzsche with these things, right? Like, oh, there is this and this percentage of blue in Monet's paintings, right? So it kind of had this very absurd feeling to it. And I think this is essentially something that perhaps became a characteristic, so let me just go, of all of this intersection, not only art history and deep learning, but digital humanities itself. And I just wanted to briefly mention this is I wrote a chapter in a book that was published actually last month called Artificial Intelligence and Art History, edited by Catherine Brown, where I also use this sketch as a kind of intro into my reflection of this field. Because so from one side you kind of seem completely absurd, but at the same time I still understood that working on art data, and particularly in computer vision, was interesting in essence because it posed some challenges that were not yet solved. Like, for example, in object recognition, you would not have people but teddy bears in paintings, right? Because of the texture. Right? So there were, or I don't know, in image captioning, this was a polar bear and this was a banana in 2019. And this was a close-up of a piece of chocolate, right? So because this field was so very much object-centered, right? Because it would relied on the kind of ImageNet tradition, which is essentially this large data set of object-labeled images, artworks represented a kind of interesting and challenging subset to actually test these methods, right, of object recognition or captioning. And but at the same time, when you talk with art historians, they were like, "What are you doing? What is this? So why are you measuring these things?" So it was kind of a time also when I would say the initiative to actually bring people from various different disciplines together started, so to say, a decade ago, maybe in this field of digital art history. I remember being part of this Coding Dürer event, which took place in 2017, organized by Harald Klinke in Munich. And I think this was maybe, I'm not sure, but one of those first events where the idea was to bring together art historians and computer scientists and artists and various people of various backgrounds. And we had to kind of come up with a project. We had a week and we had to work on something together. And this is essentially when I kind of became painfully aware of what does it actually mean to do interdisciplinary work, because we were brainstorming for a week and we just couldn't converge to any idea that we would seem that everybody would feel like, yeah, this makes sense, or let's do this, you know. So we ended up doing, I don't remember, something, you know, some kind of show off with some networks, something, right? But nothing essentially relevant or not something that would kind of be of interest to all of the participants in that project. So I started to kind of try to figure out what is this intersection, what is this field, and what are the type of people and projects that you actually encounter. So on one side you have, let's say, computer scientists that are basically working on their methods as a kind of core interest, right? And we use these data sets, we maybe appropriate them, we don't, you know, we just use them to maybe advance our methods to a certain degree. Then on the other side, you have art historians, humanities scholars, and for their core research interest is this data set, and they have a different approach to these methods. These methods should be tools that kind of accelerate or extend their research practices, but not necessarily change their research practices, right? They don't alter them. They're here to change or help, but not necessarily make anything really new. And my goal was to kind of come to this, let's say, point of true interdisciplinarity, that this interdisciplinarity happens on a kind of methodological level, right? Where we don't just use tools or use data sets, but we actually come up with some new type of research that is interesting to both sides. And I think this is something that is quite challenging. I try to get to that place. I'm not sure if I ever did. But I do think, I think projects like this are rare in all digital humanities, but I do think that somehow in the times that we live today, we're coming more and more closer to this point, but I will talk about this a little bit later. So anyway, my first attempt after, let's say, giving up this classification task and say, okay, it's not about finding better models that can get some kind of higher accuracy, but let's try to be more grounded in art historical knowledge. You know, that was the next step. And it was also kind of a trend that was happening at the time with other researchers that we kind of turned to the big names in art history like Wölflin or Panofsky, right? And they try to kind of model these things. And there was this influential paper by Algamal and colleagues, The Shape of Art History in the Eyes of the Machine, in which they actually showed that these representations learned by neural networks also correlate with Wölflin's descriptions. They had a kind of small data set annotated with these descriptions. So building on their work, I wanted to train neural network models that can kind of predict the values of these features. In particular, Wölflin defined 5 different contrasting principles, and to kind of build a model that can kind of measure that and test it on a large scale. Does it correspond to how things changed in art history? And also use it perhaps as a way to visualize collections differently, because this was also a time around 2017, 18, where this type of representation became quite common as digitized collections emerged, and they kind of wanted it. And I think in CUDAN, everybody is familiar with this because you were also very much working on projects related to this kind of visualizations. But essentially, many of these visualizations were, again, let's say, based on the type of image similarity that emerges in this notion of object similarity, right? Because you're using networks that are trained on data sets that differentiate objects. So the kind of idea was, can we maybe implement this using more nuanced, more subtle types of measures, right? So this was always my let's say, motivation to try to find those kind of abstract and subtle types of measures that are not easy to be numerically defined, and try to see, can we go there? Can something be done? Anyway, so I was, let's say, in my own bubble still of computer science and thinking, okay, I'm doing something more relevant to art history. And I was presenting this work at a conference, I think Digital Art History in Zagreb a few years ago. And then I talked with an art historian and he said, well, that's all nice, but nobody cares about Wilflin anymore. You know, like, okay, art historians, of course, when you're not embedded and you're not like in the day-to-day interaction, you have not studied, you think art history. I approached it in a kind of more high school level knowledge, right? Going back to some of the major names. And essentially, this also reflected perhaps a bigger pattern, something that later on Amanda Wasilewski addressed in her book, Computational Formalism. She was one of the, I would say, rare art historians that actually took the time and effort to analyze these papers that were published mainly in computer vision venues and worked with our data sets. And so she kind of, wrote about it in a kind of critical way, but also basically highlighting something that was obvious, that these approaches were reviving a kind of formalistic approach to analyzing art, that we were basically not in this pre-critical theory time where these things were not yet possible to even address, right? That many of these things were out of context, that we took images, that we were Western-centric, only oriented mainly on paintings. But all of these are, of course, essentially limitations of the field. And when you think about the fact that very, very difficult in computer vision to even, try to recognize if it's a Picasso or a Dali in 2013. It's kind of natural that we have this sort of trajectory of development, right? So I was considering this: is it a kind of situation in which there is a kind of recapitulation theory going on, right? That this field of digital art history has to recapitulate art history based on this Ernst Haeckel theory, which was debunked, but essentially, that the embryonic development briefly repeats the evolutionary stages of its species, right? So this is the kind of idea that an item of something has to go through this development of the whole field. So I was essentially questioning, is it the fact that we're going through these stages of formalism, that it's a very natural a form of evolution for digital art history to reflect the steps of art history. And if it is so, then the question, of course, emerges, where are we now, or where are we heading, right? And I think that essentially the things that we're witnessing that are happening with generative AI at the moment are also showing that the fields are, let's say, converging, right? That we are becoming more critical and more self-reflective, and actually that this sort of makes sense. But before going a little bit deeper into the notion of the contemporary challenges, I would like to also reflect a little bit on that other aspect of creating art with AI, because having spent several years in this field, whenever I talked about, AI and art, I realized that people have very different impressions of what does it actually mean, right? Because on one hand, what I presented now is more focused on analyzing existing art, right, with computational methods, while at the same time, this period was also a period where a lot of people started actually using these deep neural networks models and first instances of generative models to create artworks, right? And I think it's worth to kind of briefly just reflect on that aspect. I wrote a kind of review paper that summarizes some of the major aspects of both of these fields. Because back then, let's say 2018, these are all news titles from 2018, there was this, one could say, hype around doing anything creative with AI. Oh, you can write poems. Oh, you can actually write a symphony. Of course, this is all. There is, of course, an awareness that people have been using computers since the emergence of computers to do interesting and artistic things, or even before the emergence of computers, the whole concepts of serendipity, of chance, was explored a long time ago, right? So I would not go essentially now into this direction of let's say this intersection of creativity and computers. Just I would like to mention some of the major milestones in this particular decade. Such as the generative adversarial networks or the neural style transfer, or these kinds of technologies enabled a kind of emergence of a field that was coined AI art, right? Around 2018, 17, there were some, I would dare to say there was a scene of artists doing some quite interesting things with these technologies, right? Mario Klingerman, Robbie Barrett, Sofia Crespo, just a few examples. So it was, let's say, a scene that started emerging within the kind of more artistically oriented domain of not analyzing, but using these methods to create something new. And these works, I think, are interesting to reflect on them from today's perspective, also because of how this whole intersection of creating art with AI changed just in the last few years, and some of the tensions, some of the that kind of emerged back then also are relevant now. For example, while there was a kind of vibrant scene of artists doing things with generative adversarial networks, perhaps one of the most famous examples became this portrait, Edmond Bellamy portrait, by the Obvious Collective, because it was something that was sold on a Christie's auction for a kind of very large, ridiculous price that nobody expected back then. And because it was kind of presented as being done by AI or produced by an algorithm, right? So it kind of leveraged on this personification of these models, while at the same time it was actually a result of different layers of work, right? Somebody created or came up with this architecture of the generative adversarial network. The code that this collective used was a public code made public on a GitHub repo from another artist, Robbie Barrett. The model was trained on a data set of paintings, right, produced by other artists. So essentially, it became a kind of emblematic example of what does it mean to be an author, especially when there's now money involved. So it kind of became ethically important to discuss who is doing what and what is it that we're witnessing, in essence, a kind of dispersion of authorship, a kind of fragmentation. But also it was a time of really trying to reflect for the first time maybe who in essence is responsible, and also trying to approach these questions in a more responsible way. This question of who is the author and who is responsible for a work is also something that continues to emerge as an, let's say, unresolved question, because in a kind of more recent survey paper that was published 2 years ago, which did a kind of survey on various artists and what they think about also the threats of AI to their livelihood and so on, but also who kind of owns the output of the models. And you see that there is not really a consensus who is responsible, who should be kind of the one that says, oh, this belongs to me, right? And so these are debates that we're also currently witnessing. But essentially what I wanted to kind of summarize is that this period, let's say between 2017 and 2020, was a phase in which the use of AI was kind of something that was interesting. It was heavily anthropomorphized, right? Because it existed on this narrative that was built around the use of these models, but it was kind of predating this big fatigue that we have today, right? Because we can say that essentially the headlines were, oh, this artwork was made by AI, or this symphony was composed by AI. Today, you would actually require, we come to this point where you kind of, I think maybe the next step will be to have certificates that you actually have something that is 100% human done, right? So it's where it's kind of, we're moved away from this phase where people are trying to make use of this narrative into something that has, it's become so integrated in our everyday lives that it's still kind of interesting to reflect on this phase of using AI to create art. But how did we come to this point, and where are we now, and what were actually the main, let's say, milestones? Because the whole previous decade, one could say, was mainly a monomodal, right? So all of the developments were focused on different types of data, right? You had text analysis and text generating and image analysis, sound analysis, and in all of these fields you had different types of neural network models developed that would do these types of analysis, but and they essentially, on a conceptual level, perform similarly in the sense that they can be used to extract these embeddings, these high-level representations that can then be transformed into a kind of latent space of images and words and texts. But what was not possible was to actually merge these spaces, right? The space of words and the space of images into the same latent space, into the same hyperdimensional representations of features, right? In which you could actually measure the semantic similarity directly. So this was the big revolution that actually happened in 2021 with the introduction of the CLIP model by OpenAI, and at the same time, the CLIP model, I think many of you are familiar with now, by now, because it is a model that, right, enables you to kind of measure the similarity between text and images, and very quickly also, basically same day, OpenAI also introduced the first image text-to-image model, right, DALL-E. And this was something that was quite, as a computer vision scientist, I was at the time also working a lot of image captioning issues. And I think many of us were surprised because this going from images to text was still challenging, and going from text to image was considered, of course, there was work that was being done, but it was considered quite far away from the results that OpenAI presented with this model. And essentially what started then was a kind of attempt to recreate this model in a more open source setting, right? Because this model was not available. So only 5 days later, you had the first implementation by Ryan Murdoch called Deep Days. And of course, here you can see the images were quite bad in comparison to DALL-E. And then what followed was, perhaps I dare to say, maybe the last really exciting or truly creative time in the development of these models, where you had a kind of, in the next year or so, really every few months, a new implementation. And it was a quite community-based contribution of, people were sharing these models on social networks and discussing this and kind of coming up with better, more and more advanced implementations. And also at the time I was working as a postdoc at Durham on a project on the Liverpool Biennial, and we used these first versions of generated images to kind of enhance the digital collection of the Liverpool Biennial by creating generated images from the title of the paintings and creating and captions from the images, the original images of the actual paintings, and then kind of creating a synthetically augmented version of the biennial. And I precisely think that maybe what made it kind of interesting to implement or use these things back then was the fact that they were not super realistic, that these images back then in winter and spring 2021 looked something like this, right? But essentially what happened, only a year later, these images became so photorealistic, so convincing that you could not really differentiate them between real photographs anymore, right? And so this was the time of Midjourney, DALL-E 2, Stable Diffusion, and a kind of beginning of the commercial phase of text-to-image models. And essentially this year before was still quite exciting, and then it somehow became more and more focused just on the kind of uniform type of aesthetic and realism of the images. Of course, not all of the issues were resolved, right? You would always have these like finger issues, right? You don't have like 6 fingers. These models were still not perfect, but the dynamic was such that you would present something and then people would discuss it online, and then they would kind of test it, and very soon, a new model would emerge that had these issues resolved. But essentially, what was it that enabled the development of these models and multimodal models, in essence, was actually data, right? And how much, what does it mean in comparison to the, let's say, previous transformation of computer vision that happened with the introduction of ImageNet, which had 14 million images, and in practice 1 million was actually used to train models. The CLIP dataset was trained on 400 million images. So of course this is an enormous increase in data that we use, and then later on, of course, it also extended with the Lion dataset and 5 billions and so on. So now is the fact that these models were trained on such an enormous amounts of data actually became the point of interest into these models. What is it that they encode? What is it that they extract from all of these data sets? And so people it essentially started as a discussion on social media, but some of the main research areas, for example, various types of demographic bias that I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, the kind of gender bias that exists in these models. This is an example from 2023 with, not sure with which mid-journey model, but if you have an artist, female artist in front of her paintings, you get like a young-looking artist, and a male artist, you get a kind of more serious, elderly-looking man. So all of these subtle biases that became discussed eventually kind of transformed into a systematic exploration of these models, which is a kind of ongoing topic right now in AI research. And it's not only about what these models encode, what type of biases they encode, but also how we resolve and how we handle these biases. Familiar with these examples of one of the Gemini models, in which they try to kind of resolve this bias by actually creating even more absurd outputs of kind of gender diversified, racially diversified prompts in a kind of non-natural way, which then kind of backfired. But it also opened up a lot of spaces for discussing, not only how culture is encoded, but also what are the types of interventions that we imply that we actually use, what are the type of evaluations. And essentially it kind of shifted the whole perspective on AI models as tools to kind of models that can be studied in their own right, and something that Ted Underwood coined as models of culture, right? With these models are not just tools anymore, because they're trained on such an enormous amount of data they actually encode, so many aspects of data of our actually everyday lives of our world, right? So they become, in a way, spaces of culture. And I would say that this is a very interesting ongoing dimension of research currently, something that we're also focused in the project that I'm leading right now, this how to study culture. And currently I would say that this notion of culture is mainly associated with this kind of geographically based stereotypes, right? In which we research is focused on actually analyzing, okay, what are the stereotypes, what are the biases that these models kind of show and indicate in relation to different countries or different settings and different cultures, right? So this is a kind of ongoing, interesting research field. What we did recently was also focus on the kind of historical aspect of representation and not to look only into the kind of demographic bias, but also other types of biases. In a paper that published, we looked into the kind of stylistic biases and how if you prompt these models with different types of activities, but situate them in different periods, how models kind of assign a default type of style to these periods, but also how kind of historically accurate they are, how often they can exhibit various types of anachronisms, or also how demographically accurate they are in this kind of gender and racial representation. So one of the aspects of our current work was kind of to focus on these aspects in the relation to the depiction of the past in these models. So essentially, I would say there is a necessity to kind of find a balance between keeping these models a mirror image of the society as it is, keeping them kind of faithful to what happened and to what was, but also essentially use them as a tool in a responsible way in which we do not propagate these biases further if we don't want them to be part of them, right? So this is a kind of balance that is, I would say, a certain challenge to achieve right now. And this is the kind of shift of interest in the current approach to AI. But what about art? What about the starting point? So in relation to the use of multimodal and generative models, I think in the beginning, it was quite popular to prompt things in the style of, and then a name of a particular painter, right? And so this was a kind of trend when these models emerged. And essentially it grew into an interesting research question because people would started assembling lists and lists of names, so-called artist studies, right? To see who of these artists is remembered, right? Back then, these images were not so realistic and not so threatening to the artists themselves because they were kind of bad enough, but you could still kind of see if the model gets the artist, right? I mean, in the meantime, the models became so advanced that it started to become a problem, right? So instead of actually asking who is remembered and who's forgotten, which is the kind of question behind the kind of latent canon idea, the question shifted towards who wants to be remembered and who wants to be forgotten, who actually, because kind of artists wanted to started suing these companies for the use of their artworks without consent, right? Started to kind of protest the way that that their work is injected and reproduced by these models, right? So we kind of come to the point of having to find ways to find a solution for these issues, right? To actually protect artists. And one of the steps, one of the kind of subfields of contemporary generative AI emerged in the form of the machine unlearning challenge, right? In which several papers and several works are kind of trying to find ways of how to erase specific concepts. And I was recently, reading one of these papers on concepts erasure, because as if somebody says, look, I don't want to be part of that model, how do you actually remove some data? And that became a big challenge. And I essentially found myself, reading a paper after a decade of reading papers of how we can train neural network models to better represent the world. I'm actually now reading how we can make them unlearn what they know. And it felt a kind of ironic and a kind of funny moment to be actually in the point of asking this question now, can computers unlearn to recognize art? It started with, can they learn? And now it's about unlearning, right? It's a completely different challenge. And it essentially also represents a sort of ironic twist in the whole development of this field, right? Because for years we were, as computer vision scientists, criticized for not having enough context, not having good enough models, right? That the models were, limited just on images or not being able to connect things. And now it's all of a sudden these models became so advanced that this particularly represents a new form of research challenge, right? How to fit them in the kind of overall landscapes of the practices surrounding these models. As for the some of the tasks that were interesting back then, to recognize this is more or less obsolete. We don't need classification models anymore. Many of the questions have been resolved. For example, what was polar bear 6 years ago, now if you use contemporary captioning models, you get a very detailed explanation of the painting, as well with other types of other paintings. So this gap that existed, this gap that made the analysis of art images interesting from a kind of perspective of a computer vision scientist, also, let's say, disappeared. So it's kind of difficult to find anything that is still challenging to do, something that is still not possible to do with contemporary AI models. In the realm of creativity, I think there is a kind of fatigue and almost a nostalgia for this period of AI art between 2018 and 20, when people were still using GANs. These are some quotes from a very recent paper that did a survey on artists that were actually doing things with AI over years, and how they relate to these things, and how they reflect on what is happening today, how they feel this somehow many of these aspects are lost, how they have this kind of nostalgia on when the models were not good enough, because that had a certain aesthetic appeal of its own, right? The fact that they were not perfect and photorealistic or kitschy in a kind of glowy, fluffy way, right? So essentially now the question is, where is the field going? What are the emerging questions? And somehow it feels like as a starting point, the kind of the measuring what was not measurable, approaching artworks using computational methods, which seemed back then kind of absurd, because of course you cannot measure these things, all of a sudden became let's say all of a sudden over a course of a decade, of course, became quite resolvable, and different challenges emerged, right? And I think in this intersection of fields, I think we're entering a point in which perhaps it's becoming more and more important to actually evaluate, to actually reflect on the kind of ethical dimensions of the use of these models, the various cultural dimensions. So there are some challenges left, but these challenges are becoming more and more difficult to identify, let's say. It's shifted from recognizing a label of belonging to a particular style movement or an artist, to actually trying to figure out what is it that models of AI models of today cannot do. It's becoming more and more difficult to find these, let's say, areas of inquiry or these types of challenges. Thank you. That would be it from my side. And please, if you have any kind of questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, super cool. Thank you very much. So there is okay, this was a clap. Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of questions. Like, let me start with the very end that you came to, where you said there's sort of not much to do, which seems a little bit like, to use a skiing metaphor, there is no powder snow, but all is moguls now. Like every hill has been skied, and now there's a different way of how to perform it, basically, right? So the question is, what is the kind of stuff that really would enthuse you? Like, are you still in the business of sort of like legitimizing yourself as a computer scientist doing art history, or an art historian doing some computation, and getting to this, quote, what you said, true interdisciplinarity? Is that really the game that we're in? Or if we could surmise, imagine we're a crowd of just true interdisciplinary people, and even interdisciplinary in a sense that is critical and creative. Like it's about understanding the image and creating the image. And then like I think I don't know, like I at least have this sort of thing that like when I'm not in academic mode, where I sort of have to make a living as an art historian / cultural analyst, but sort of like if I ask myself what enthuses me the most, there is a lot of things, because these latent spaces are so fundamentally unexplained, aren't they?
Yes, yes, this is definitely this is definitely something that is still interesting, and but it's kind of also, for example, the latent space, or the question, for example, of bias. It emerged through interaction, kind of spontaneously. People started sharing, look, oh, these models are biased, and then it kind of transformed into a very systematic way of actually exploring, and you have data sets and benchmarks and people, really doing the kind of, okay, the interventions are still maybe not clear, but somehow it became also, okay, not that interesting, or at least on this kind of, oh, I'm not going to do bias, like demographic bias. I'm going to try to find other forms of biases or something more subtle, or it's always this kind of chasing the subtles, chasing the things that are not so obvious. I feel that's kind of the thing of my whole research path, trying to find something that is, okay, this is it, but now it's changing, or now let's try to see something. And there are many things. I mean, essentially, I'm fascinated by this whole encapsulation of data, of all the relationships, especially images and text, and because this is, for example, something that is that still exists on a kind of, the simple notion of semantic understanding. There is an alignment between images and text because it exists like that in the data set. But, the relation between images and text can be so very different, right? And so this is also something that we're currently working on. I haven't mentioned it now, but it's kind of on this kind of multimodal iconicity, and how, some iconic relationships between images and text alter these, or are passed on in these models, in these generative models. But regarding your question of the interdisciplinarity, for example, I felt I'm currently hosted by the Institute of Art History, right, as a kind of computer scientist. And when I was writing this project proposal several years ago, it kind of felt somehow logical to go a little bit more in that direction. Now I feel I need to go back again to maybe computer science, because what happened was also, you had this specifically in digital humanities, you had humanities scholars that were digital, right, that were interested in the digital, but there were somehow a minority. But now in the last few years, everybody is interested in AI. You cannot ignore it, right? It's somehow not something that just the digital humanities crew is doing. Everybody is doing it. Everybody is kind of discussing it. So it's kind of becoming saturated as a space of discussing it, discussing AI in this intersection. It's not so special anymore. Not, you know what I mean? It's kind of trying.
Yeah.
There are many, which is kind of good, because this is what we're trying to get to, that point, to get to this level of interdisciplinarity. And I think it kind of spontaneously happened.
I got myself into a pickle sort of like around 2013, when there was a budding digital humanities crowd at the university where I was starting to teach as as an associate professor. And I said, like, we should probably be very cautious with this word digital, because astronomers, and actually I stole this thought from a colleague who was an astronomer, who said, like, digital astronomy had a very brief time in the 1980s until sort of Kodak stopped doing photoplates. And then all astronomy was just digital. And I think that's exactly the kind of like way in which we operate, right? Like you can't ignore it, it's always there. And so one of the key things is that art history is both, and I said that in 2016 in an article, is both a discipline and a subject area. So the subject area, like the matter of art history, is sort of something that spends, depending on what you focus on, Western Europe, it's like 2,500 years. and that grows exponentially, and you got like a certain corpus of material which may not be finite, but in a sense quasi-finite and whatever. So you can have that as a thing, but then the discipline itself is actually a social system. So there's a very small crowd. If you look at the United States, sort of like 80% of all art historians teaching at universities are, they have done their PhD in Yale, Princeton, Harvard in that sequence, and then sort of like become museum directors, and they all know each other. And as you say, they have this debate, right? So that's like sort of like if they say it's old, yeah, if you look at 8.3 billion people being interested in visual art, which may mean something very different for different people, what does old even mean? Like that is, I think, a key question. It should be possible for a researcher to sort of like enter a field and sort of like do this ontological, ontogenic recapitulation, which people do when they learn physics, which people do when they learn how to draw, which people do when they learn how to compute, what people do when they study art history. I mean, like, we sort of like learn in iterative manners and ways. And then the problem is like we don't want to specialize too quickly, right? And I think that is one of the key issues, that this matter of art history in history, that the corpus that we study, which you organically put in, like, if you look at, like, because you're a computer scientist, add ImageNet as a corpus, just like you look at WikiArt as a corpus, which in itself is a matter of art history, which has 25-year-old Asian women and 45-year-old men, because Pfeiffer Lee was using her own computer to sort of like crawl the web. So that is a form of art history, which is not an art history that would be accepted in an art history department that where everybody, according to the College Art Association, has to have a decade in the country on which they focus, and ideally one artist, and write a monograph and be part of the larger sort of conversation. I think that is one very, very important thing, that in some sense, by being at that interface where you sort of like, you work for art historians or with art historians, you narrow the scope of what art history could be, where you had a much more natural sort of approach to it, which in some sense, the key question is like, how can we reestablish that? That, I think, is a really interesting thing, right? Because we're talking of way too little artworks to actually make any kind of like statement about the history of art in general. When we look at 150,000 artworks, for example, it's just not enough, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's like my personal ramble opinion regarding this. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was still what is, as I mentioned, like kind of this interdisciplinarity is becoming kind of more, I don't know, cohesive, or somehow more with what was happening recently, right? Many people more aware of it. But at the same time, when you're writing a project on the systemic level, you still have to follow some kind of boxes, like, oh, my project is either this or that, or where am I? Everybody feels like in this, there's been this, the word interdisciplinarity was such a buzzword, for such a long time. Everybody's, yeah. But at the same time, still, like when you're in between, you're a bit lost, because essentially you're not, for me, especially, for example, I don't have the background that is necessary to be, part of one institution, like art historian. Mm-hmm. And then again, I'm not fully computer science. So you kind of end up being somewhere in between and being a bit lost, and also kind of depending if there will be some kind of panel of a project proposal review that will actually acknowledge the interdisciplinarity of things. And I think this is, it's so natural, but at the same time, the system and the way it is designed is still, I would say, a bit old-fashioned in that way, right?
I think this is sort of something that you bring up, which is really cool, because like I have very much experienced it exactly that way. Like with network science, there was no panel. Introducing networks in art history was sort of bold essay in my PhD. I survived it, let's put it like that. And there was no way getting this funded by the European Research Council. At some point, they invited me as a panelist. And then 10 years later, somebody got something for something very similar I proposed 10 years earlier, because the world wasn't ripe for it. And then eventually it is ripe for it. And one thing I sort of like have sort of like experienced is that as you're working between two disciplines and you're the one doing sort of something in between, that there is a growing crowd. Like that crowd is also growing exponentially. And ideally, within your career, at some point, the crowd is large enough. So it peer reviews each other, they have journals, they have a shared interest, and then it can become its own thing. But going through that phase, I think, is really, really difficult. And one thing which I think is important is interdisciplinarity, like two people from two different disciplines meeting in the same room. According to, like, there was a clear sort of like description of this in Wikipedia for a while. It's just one way of doing this. One is multidisciplinarity, where people actually sort of do something together from multiple disciplines that actually work together. But then sort of like long range, your dream in the middle, where you say, I'm an art historian and I'm a computer scientist at the same time, doing this transdisciplinarily, which has become a concept in ecology. In Derek Bucher is here in the audience, like, you know, the people in sort of stewardship of the planetary ecosystem, they actually talk about it like that. You need to be a climate scientist and you need to be a social scientist. You need to be qualitative and quantitative all at the same time. There's no way you will just have different people in the room. You need to sort of master all of this, which is sort of a huge issue, because that means, by the way, we're actually capable of doing it. We're like 50 years old, right? And so that is sort of like, I think, a sort of like serious issue. And in this field in which you're operating, that operates so fast, so much stuff happens, that you could ask yourself, any idea you have, you need to ask the question, is this something I can wait for? Is this something I need to do myself because it's esoteric enough? Because typically, if it's good enough, it's probably done by somebody else too. So the question is, how do we deal with this? And that is sort of something where, you know, where this seminar series has that as a sort of generating mechanism, where people can encounter each other, even they're fundamentally different, and they may have a crowd, but they may not have sort of like, you know, there is no D crowd, basically, in essence. Mike Tom has a question.
Well, basically, first I wanted to point out that there was a question in the chat.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
You want to ask your question first?
No. First, let's address the person in the chat, because it is there for a while, I guess.
Okay. I had a similar question about canvas, type, color, medium, and depth, and layers to creation. Has any model been able to show this by creating individual brush strokes and pressure, etc.? Is there a mode that shows the level of depth? If you have time, if not too big a deal, it was just a curiosity. Thank you very much for the question.
Well, if I understand correctly.
So maybe, Derek, do you want to speak up yourself? What you meant? Like, this referred to some part in the talk, right?
My stuff off mute. Yes, I was just asking, can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yes.
Asking, you know, what I'm seeing is, I watched presentation. Thank you very much. It was excellent. I was asking about layers of depth. Like, if I go to a museum and I see a painting, it's a painting that's been done over a series of time with brush strokes and depth and different types of mediums. Even going out throughout art history, we have, you know, the mediums working on, you know, maybe skin to papyrus, you know, different types of layers. So I'm asking, does the AI models actually understand that? Do they and those different layers and those different types of mediums, or do they just replicate color?
So the materiality, in a sense. Okay.
Well, the question is which AI model. I mean, if you ended with, do they replicate color, hinting maybe at the generative models that are kind of trained on various artwork data sets. But I think there is, I mean, in this whole intersection of using computational methods to analyze artwork, there has been a lot of work that I did not mention in this talk, and some of it is also focused on actually trying to analyze the layers and the brush strokes of actually one of the first things that was done was this kind of brush stroke analysis and of different paintings in which they used this kind of wavelet transformations to kind of transform into the kind of wavelet, the pixel level, the frequency level, and then there you could, for example, see it was done to kind of differentiate between forgeries and the original, because a brush stroke of a forgery is kind of more frequent, so to say, like there is this kind of in texture, there are this minimal changes in frequency that you can actually then detect using these methods. But this is like really, so there is a bunch of work that was focusing also on the levels, on also analyzing artworks that were done on by different people, right? To kind of differentiate the master had its students and who did what, and some of the important work. So there is work dealing with that aspect in the kind of computational analysis part. And now your question was about the generating aspect, if it was both, that I'm not sure if I understood correctly.
Forensic.
Yeah, sorry.
Forensic, more forensic. Like,
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So there is a bunch of, so there is, let's say, a subset also of computer vision doing these types of things, also this kind of forensic analysis, right? Yeah.
I think there's an interesting thing where we need to talk about this, the tail end of citation, where actually other art histories, like in archaeology, this is way more common, that people actually sort of analyze material properties like terracotta, consistency, rim width of plates and stuff like that, or they put the pochard on their tongue. So there's all sorts of different sensors that sort of like you could actually recognize objects with, and that could be analyzed. And computer science, both computer science and sort of art history in a broader sense, particularly archaeologies, are actually very proficient in that, and they do this since like sort of decades. Like there's my favorite paper in this regard is 35 years of principal component analysis, and so basically summarizing that it doesn't work in archaeology because there's obviously the world doesn't arrange in principal components. But that paper already is like 30 years old. So it's this kind of like weird thing that we have all these computational methods. And so in some sense, that is another story of digital art history, in a sense, because if what you sort of like summarize is really, really cool, and you made sure to sort of like, link to the pioneers of generative art and stuff like that, while you said like very clearly you focus on the last 10 years, and digital art history is also something that happens the last 10 years, but both of these things have much longer traditions. And in particular, what I think is interesting is that not only do they have common roots in terms of computation, but also conceptually. So that is a sort of like really interesting thing, that this whole embedding space notion sort of like has the same roots as Warburgian art history in a sense. And I think there is a sort of like, this could be taken to another level. But that, in that sense, is not something that works with benchmark data sets, but you would have to have, all this sensor data, like, CAT scans of artworks and stuff like that. So this is sort of like, and spectrograms.
I mean, the question about forensics and what Darren asked is we really, it's kind of the more practical, the more actually useful, or you can say meaningful aspect of this intersection, where there is maybe a way to use these methods to actually tackle some real issue. And this was something that I kind of not consciously, but somehow always avoided somehow never wanted to go into anything that had to be practical or resolve any issue, but more, conceptually, can we measure style, right? Because it's somehow, it doesn't have any purpose, right? But it's just kind of interesting in itself. So, of course, there is a lot of work that is maybe more grounded in the discipline, or it's something that can be used or was used. And yeah, it was kind of my talk was mainly more focused on some of the other aspects that I was personally more interested in.
Mike.
Yes, well, actually, to turn this question a little bit to a different side, in that sort of less forensic and more maybe more generally cultural. I was at this early stage, sort of pre-generative AI stage, which you were talking about. I was sort of thinking that artwork, generally speaking, artwork is not a collection of pixels. Yes, it's not only, well, number one, it is sort of material object which exists outside of the memory of a computer, but also it sort of has all these cultural connotations, etc. So you can show a person, I don't know, 10 different low quality depictions of, I don't know, whatever, Starry Night, and everybody will recognize it as a Starry Night. Yes. My question always was, when it was just pixels, my question was actually, are we capturing with all this study of classification of artworks, etc.? Do we capture actually the cultural meaning? But now, when it is also so embedded in text, it seems that this question also, as you said, so many questions are now redundant. It seems that by now, definitely yes. That of course it exists in the cloud of all these meanings and all this literature around these artworks. But then maybe it is possible to somehow ask research questions further on. For example, what is the minimal amount of information to reconstruct basically art history out of just images, or is it how much additional sort of textual information and interpretation is needed for a say LLM or generative AI model to learn art or something like this. And so that was more or less comment more than a question. And actually, to turn it into a question, do you have any? I mean, indeed, from what you said, and I completely share this feeling that there is some sort of feeling of uncertainty and awkwardness. Yes, so much things is these new things, they are so capable that it is not clear what question to ask. Do you have any ideas of good research questions at this stage? What is interesting to know now?
Oh yeah, but I'm not going to share them. Competitive feeling, you know. No, I mean, I kind of, yeah, I kind of pointed out to that. You know, you also become aware of something spending a decade in academia that you don't talk about some things prematurely. No, I mean, it's I think what is essentially challenging is this. One thing that was kind of interesting that happened is that for a long time, you know, people had this idea, okay, art or creativity is kind of safe from the AI takeover because, and I think still this is somehow, we're still processing this fact because essentially our attitude towards computers as machines is, you know, they're here to help with repetitive and predictive tasks, something that they should kind of be used for, right? And then this, oh, you can do art was kind of, oh, exotic, precisely because it broke this very focused on, okay, yeah, this is what we use machines for and not something else. Oh, we can actually use them for something else. And now it's almost, yeah, it kind of took over, or it became so difficult to be more creative, let's say. I mean, it's also, we have to be very careful with the language that we use nowadays in relation to models, precisely because of the way they're being interpreted and sold and kind of embedded in our everyday lives. But essentially, it's somehow all of a sudden writing and drawing or whatever, I mean, the process, not, of course, the focus comes from the process, but let's say the final product becomes so convincing, or it creates this illusion of creativity so well that it's a bit of a, I would say, shock, still for the kind of collective mindset in which machines are used for something else and not for this. And if they're used, then it's a little bit in an awkward way, or now, or all of a sudden, what to do, because the fundamental attack on something that we consider to be the safest aspect of ourselves, right, is now being actually the one that is very easy. I mean, it's easy to model. It's not easy. The whole process was not easy. It's a result of such a collective work of so many people over so much of a long period of time. But the things that we have now, this magic box that you just prompt, seems kind of easy, right? So I think here is this is the perspective that is changing, and also why it is difficult to maybe find, also from a kind of more personal research position type of situation, in which I was kind of interdisciplinary, and then you're like, oh, you're doing this thing, so this is kind of acknowledged, and as mentioned previously, there is this group of people that starts growing around a certain field. But now these changes also kind of introduced some shifts within the field and within the dynamics, because all of a sudden there are more and more people, from various different disciplines entering the field. Everybody has the need to discuss AI. It becomes kind of saturated. We're also kind of fed up with it, and it's not, it's not cool anymore, to do these things. I mean, essentially, you could get away with for a while doing something.
So there's the internal running gag in fluid dynamics. If you want to have a new idea for a PhD, just open the faucet and stare and play around with the faucet at home, right? And so in some sense, it seems like what you're saying is true, that it's like everybody's having the same discussions, and there's certain things that need time to fold out, like how biased is the bias and stuff like that. But in some sense, people will do that for us. The key question is, what's the equivalent of the faucet? Like, can you stare at this and not do the same thing as everybody else? Like, because yeah, it's a no-brainer to sort of classify Starry Night as Starry Night. You can even have it's boring to say style transfer, where you transfer an image into everybody else's image is not style transfer. And it's like all these things are now expected. But I think one of the key issues is sort of like imagine there would be an exhibition and we would go to a new mountain nobody has ever skied. And then the question is, what can we do there? And so what is the kind of thing we would love to do, in a sense? And I think that is not quite clear. And it's in the same way, I feel about this in the same way as, whenever you do scrambled eggs, it's a scrambled egg, but like every egg is different, temperature is different, humidity is different, the fat is different, the pan is different, and whoever you want to feed it to may come or not. So is it already too dry or still liquid enough and stuff like that? So there's this huge parameter space, which these latent spaces are probably the most extreme examples. Even though they're just trained on the pixels, there's so much in there that it's not fundamentally clear what else can we do with that. And that is sort of like, I think, the key question. Like if we would ask ourselves, okay, so I'm a trained art historian, you're a trained computer scientist. But if we strip this off and it was like, okay, like I'm just Max and you're just Eva, like what is the most fascinating thing we would do, disregarding the fact that we come in informed and conditioned and disciplined to do a certain thing? Like, what is all the stuff that could be done with this kind of stuff? And there, I think you brought an amazing example with Ingrid Daubetschis with the wavelets, which is, yeah, they did this brushstroke analysis, but these wavelets are accidentally the wavelets you find when you train a neural network. They always appear on the lowest level, and she had that idea in her head. and she's a mathematician then doing too much art history. So the key question is can we sort of come up with a form of education for ourselves and for our students where we sort of can create that kind of situation where you can come up with things in your head that a computer just cannot do. And I think this has a lot to do with this resolution question, where there is some stuff that we haven't computerized yet. And the question is, what is this? What's the relation to our body? What's the relation to our perception? And in some sense, for example, I do understand that you don't want to share a research question. Nobody wants to share a research question. But what would be the audience of a symposium where we say, okay, in a year we invite 30 people, and we're not really finding art history, we're not really finding image classification, we're not really finding anything that is already in existence, but what would be the ingredients of that Lego set of minds to come up with something which hasn't been here before in that realm? Because I think it's not quite fundamentally clear what that would be. What would be the spaceship crew of doing something fundamentally interesting with these latent spaces, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's in one way, it's the kind of the latent space itself becomes the object, right, of studying. What is it? How things are encapsulated. And this was mainly my main motivation also, in particularly also between this kind of understanding the text and image relations and how they are, encoded within these models and what does it mean. But also what I consider to be somehow more and more important is also the culture surrounding the use of these models, and also how this landscape is changing. Because, for example, we did a PhD student of mine, Laura Wagner, she was focusing on the kind of the personalization, because nowadays you can actually quite easily create your own instances of personalized models, right? So that with a small data set, you kind of train this adapter, and then you can generate things very easily reflecting something. And then the way it's being used, and I mean, this is something that is also discussed. We did an analysis on the kind of personalization model sharing platforms, in which you say, it showed that the analysis of the data, 80% of it was essentially non-safe for work, right? 80% of it was used for some kind of nudification. And this is something that is being also discussed right now in relation to some of the commercial models out there that actually allow these kinds of things. But you kind of become aware that there is also this tension between genuine interest, oh, this model, this encapsulation, what is it? How can I study things within that? But also all of the ethical layers. I mean, this is something that I would say this other aspect of art and AI. I mean, many artists have been discussing for years, right? The labor conditions and all of these aspects, the biases, all of this kind of ethically concerning aspect using these models. But I kind of think it's both. What I'm currently, trying to do is figure out both ways of basically addressing, the culture within and outside of the use of these models, because somehow it's somehow sad, to have something so fascinating being used for so stupid tasks or so primitive, so also that's this kind of contrast between having this very complex thing and then using it for on a larger scale, using it for the most primitive tasks. So this is the kind of tension, also the usage of these models as a kind of interesting space of the future. I think, I mean, essentially, these are maybe the kind of two fields, right? The one that is really conceptually the latent space as a phenomenon, as something that we cannot fully grasp, explain, that we can also, I don't know, the metaphorical approach to it, what we can compare it with, and things like that. And then also the kind of the practical, the real world situations that are emerging.
Yeah, I agree. Mar, Kenneth has a question.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. It's great. the work that you like this study that you mentioned about the artists using AI before, I think was 2020 or 2021. I participated. I mean, I am an artist, Barbara Mar. I am the Mar. And yeah, it's. I mean, as an artist and also trying to become academic or something, or doing my PhD at least, trying to finish my PhD in the group of Max. Yeah, I think it's a lot of challenges still to do, and for art and for artistic research is a lot of interesting times. I think there's always has been. I think because if you take AI as a form of software and software artists as material had been using for a while, is quite a new type of place that you can do in your work. And like you were saying, each of the models are generating culture, or they have culture inside. Means in a way, artists modifying this in their own ways is also quite an interesting twist. Yeah, I think that still many people don't understand half of the things, and that is the problem. Because since they had been made very easy to run AI using the website, like paying some subscription, they basically don't understand the whole stack, and they don't understand the infrastructure and everything. But I think many artists do, and that's quite an interesting part. And yeah, in this sense, is I mean, I had read your papers. It's very interesting, your research. I'm inspired in some of the things that you wrote. Yeah, I don't have like a particular question, I think, but I mean, yeah, it was quite interesting talk. I want to even relook it after. I'm currently trying to finish the PhD. I basically developed in my PhD a 5-layer framework where artists we can control the AI, and I think this and it's funny because I wanted to study more the latent space, but then I kind of went a little bit out, just because I found that doing my PhD as an artistic research inside film media school still now is quite understood. I think my research it was much even complicated. I have the feeling.
Could you so I think this 5-layer model of Moore is really interesting in this respect, because we talked about data sets, like you mentioned it, and we talked about...
Yeah, the 5-layer model I define is basically one is data sets, the next is model, the next is interface, the next is latent space, and the last is materiality. And yeah, I mean, basically artists that use I think you mentioned something before that recall what I want to say. Like I say that basically I'm looking at artists that use AI as a medium, not as a tool. You before mentioned something with tool that I remember, and now I don't remember exact words, but was interesting, I think, was in this realm, that basically, because like, yeah, there is now a lot of use of AI, but a lot of use that doesn't understand like what is about the thing and how you can gain control. And yeah, this basically, I think, as an artist, like for example, one of my latest article is about that artists we should use open small models, because I think otherwise you basically are too unengaged on the thing. And yeah, I think this is yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, my contribution, but hopefully it makes.
I think, yeah, thank you. You raised an important point, something that I was thinking a while ago, because everybody was, okay, there is this black box, and the whole field of explainable AI also emerged as something in the last decade, something that is relevant, of course. Of course, the question is explainable to whom and in which ways. And I think art in particular here can play, this contemporary scene of intersection, where I'm not necessarily referring to, but also possible, using it as a tool for creating something, but using it as a subject that is being discussed, right?
Yes.
I think artists can play a very important role, and do play an important role in kind of enhancing this explainability in a computational way, in a kind of alternative ways, but actually helping you grasp and realize the various layers and the various aspects of what you said, what is stacked, what the processes behind of it. So I think the kind of art in the function of explainable AI is an interesting subdomain.
Still, I see that the conference that they do explainable AI, most of the times they don't engage on this kind of explainable level of the artists we do. Like they still want benchmarks and kind of user studies, make some survey if people understood something after you show the artwork and something. While I think that artistic research is about bringing new meanings to the things, and is actually is to be human, and is to kind of embody the experience, and to kind of experience differently the thing, and kind of because like most of the things that we kind of live, it has many dimensions, and one thing that AI is doing many times is like it's like reducing dimension. It's like the Disney in a way. It's like a multi-dimension reduction. Most of the people don't understand, for example, that all AI is about compression. If you look how much big is the data set and how much is the weight of the model, like it's a huge compression there. And yeah, this kind of but this one thing is to understand the technology, but the other is also to kind of bring metaphors and to bring things that matter to us, to all of us, no, in different ways. So even just bring humor to the table using these technologies. And I think artists with this, we are very good on that because like things. It's like when people say I'm doing art just because I'm doing a picture in like in digital. That's why in my model there is the last layer is materiality, because there is a lot of confusion of that. I don't know many of the artists who just like do an output of the model and that is the last thing. Either they had done a lot of manipulation before or they do after. Yeah, there's also how this is presented and so on. Because it's not the
Sorry. Especially one thing that you mentioned, which I think this metaphorical language, and how, because essentially confronted with things such as the latent space, you kind of naturally try to find metaphors to explain it. And I think this is something that can be very interesting in, making it more explainable, but not
reductionistic
injecting
in a way.
additional noise into it to make, so this is a kind of challenging aspect.
Yeah, and also to kind of the thing is that the problem of AI is a very complex one, and we just like finding out the new dimensions every time the new discovery comes in. Let's call it hallucinations, or let's call it many things that they appear as when the models start to go good, then appear a new problem. It means in this regards, artists are also very good on kind of bringing this in the table, kind of all these like things. But thank you for your contribution, and I'm looking forward your next research. I'm always like reading.
Thank you.
I'd like to hook to this point of compression, which has been in information theory. Compression is reducing of the description length of the system is equated with understanding. So in some sense, you could say artificial intelligence, by compressing the raw data, is understanding the raw data, or a understanding of the raw data. And so this is sort of like an interesting one, right, regarding even the work you have done, because obviously different models have a different understanding of the same stuff. Even the same model, if you prompt it different ways, you get something different regarding the same object. And so there is this sort of like, do you see this as sort of something that is, I personally, I have a knack for this information theory way of seeing sort of like the world. And I have, like in art history, this is sort of like, you know, basically you're talking Spanish villages, basically. This is not something which is sort of like tickling a lot of people, while in computation, this is very much at the very basis of, you know, talking about the halting problem and whatever. So the question is, talking about the efficiency of an algorithm, how long it takes and stuff like that. So the question is that sort of something which you think we should invest more time in, basically, to sort of like not only have a compression that works, but sort of like understanding why it works and how it works, basically, and then sort of like figuring out what it doesn't do, because for obvious reasons, whenever you have a compression, you throw stuff away, and the stuff probably was there for a reason, right? So this is sort of what fascinates me with like original paintings, for example, or with talking about vinyl, for example. It's very interesting to listen to something, even in high fidelity and a digital stream, and then you have the actual vinyl and sounds different. So it's not just nostalgic in a sense. So the question is, what is it that
fundamental? I mean, it reminded me now. I remember one of the first, when I just started studying computer science, and we were, you know, discussing a lecture on digital signals and the kind of the analog and the digital, and it triggered a whole kind of philosophical debate in my head about, you know, what does it all mean? You know, how our whole knowledge is kind of an approximation. Everything is the whole system. You know, you put it into chunks, math, biology, art history. You know, it's all, everything, and kind of how we're, the fact that you don't hear, you know, that an MP3 is not a vinyl, that it still is, and how it is different, and how this is like, how this approximation, it gets better and better with these things, but still, what is it? You know, fundamentally, I think here on the kind of fundamental philosophical level, there is a lot of potential for interesting discussions of approaching, you know, essentially it's all information, right? I mean, going back to that level is I think very, very inspiring, can be very inspiring in many ways. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there's also this sort of like Mar has a really good example of his PhD, which is his artwork where he uses models to sort of transform ancient sculptures into something that is half generative form, but you can still see sort of the original, which is very similar to what Bernini or Agavi did in some way or another. But then one of the core things is, you know, 3D printing clay is not exactly something that has been tamed either. And so there's this huge parameter space of, you know, you can predict what's coming out because it doesn't print or not, basically. And I think that is a really, really important thing here too, that there is this sort of like other side. Like if you listen to a piece of music and I listen to a piece of music, something different happened because, you know, you may have danced to it, I don't know how to dance, or vice versa. And so there is a completely different sort of like perception going on. And I think that is sort of like something that is quite interesting in terms of machine learning, because we speak about these art history as this sort of like things you can check, like does it recognize a genre, does it recognize an artist, does it produce an image in the style of. But this sort of like thing, like the larger potential that is not related to classification, is not is debated less, right? So what happens when this is displayed on the screen, for example? What's happening when you display 65,000 artworks in a UMAP picture? What's happening to these images? Do they overlap? What's the kind of artifact that happens and stuff like that? And I think there's a rather interesting ecosmos of additional things going on, which if we understand them well, the materiality, the interface, and sort of the model segregated from the latent space, then we will probably also understand in a completely different fundamental manner what's the bounding of this, what's the possibility space of this, which will probably make us feel better, because there's a lot of stuff that humans can do that the machine will never be able to do. Like, the machine cannot have your excitement eating pasta with tomato sauce. It could do pasta with tomato sauce probably, but it probably wouldn't enjoy it the same way you enjoy it. And so that is because the machine is not yourself, right? Isn't it? So there is a much higher resolution.
Well, I am also not yourself.
Sorry? Yeah.
I am also not yourself. So.
So the key thing is there is a difference between digital computation and analog organic systems, that our resolution is way higher. And then, as Mike just points out, different organic systems, and that includes not just me and Mike or me and you, but also me tomorrow and me yesterday, are fundamentally different. And I think there will always be enough for us to sort of like understand, because if it's cheap to recognize, like if I can walk into, Coronado Chapel and it says, oh, that's Holy Teresa, it will be very good at that. But it cannot feel how I feel in this particular situation, because there's a certain temperature and a bunch of people there. And so that will be different. And basically, maybe people then focus on that. And so then there's the question, what is all this other stuff that it can't cover? I think that is in some sense important for us right now, because more and more of the stuff that can be automated will be automated, and that will be used to control. And if only sort of like, if you have surveillance systems working with AI, like face recognition at every door and stuff like that, like in China, for example, then you will not be free to do all these other things, right? That is sort of something which I wonder. What is the kind of stuff where this whole AI is so limited, and what is the residual, and can we work with that? Like, what would that be, basically? And in some sense, it seems to me that researchers like you, or maybe Mar, will be the people who give part of the answer, because you have to understand these systems very, very well in order to sort of like show us the limitations of them, isn't
it? We're faced with an existential crisis, and maybe that's good. Also for art and for, various different, also for academic system, for everything, to shake it up a little bit and see what remains, how it will transform. Yeah.
Yeah. This was, we almost hit the 2 hours. Do you have any final comment? Or should we call it a day?
Sorry, I didn't hear you asked a question to me or somebody else.
Yeah, to you. I said, like, we almost hit the 2 hours. So the question is, like, do you have any final comment or a question to us?
Well, I don't know. At this point, after 2 hours, I think it's, I just wanted to thank you, because I think what you're doing, I saw also the other lectures. I think it's great to have a space, to discuss so various different things, and just keep doing what you're doing, because I think you're going in a good direction with your lab and everything. It also is one of those places that kind of seemed in this landscape, seemed to kind of be as something that is identifying, the future challenges in a kind of good way. As you mentioned, 10 years before you do something. And so it's also, the cultural lab itself, it's becoming a kind of buzzword, cultural AI and so on. So it's...
Yeah. Thank you very much. Like, our big project ended sort of like in August 2024. That's like something I need to mention. The 6 postdocs, 6 PhD students produced 70 publications with 103 co-authors, which is great. I'm only on 20 or 22. But the key thing is, like, what's important is, like, it's certainly an envelope. So we're on the tail end, and sort of like we're still doing the event series. But what's important is that this spreads. And so now one of the key questions is indeed, like, maybe this is called completely different in 5 years or in 10 years. But indeed, what we try to do with this corpus of lectures, and that includes very much you, is to sort of like show a broader audience what is possible if we sort of like forget about these disciplinary boundaries, even though people are very much disciplined in a sense individually, but we do think that they all sort of like come together. And so there's sort of something which, I can do this like with announcing the next talk, sort of like we have David Mimno and a PhD student, which is Axel Box, and we'll talk about extracting character movements. But one of the interesting things is that sort of David Mimno is sort of like part of a sort of ecocosmos, which is sort of, you could call proto-digital humanities, but also very much sort of, rooted in classics, but very much embedded with these, sort of LDA and like, whatever has become topic modeling and stuff like that. So there's a very interesting thing that this overlap, like you, does exist in different niches. He's more a text person, I'm more a visual person, for example. And I think if we don't create these sort of like crowd gatherings, then we will never encounter. Like you can basically completely live without talking any time to a linguist, right? When you do this sort of art stuff. Should you? Yes, of course, because there is this sort of like stuff in between. And I think in the grand scheme of things, we're still too bounded. Like it's exactly like, oh, we're looking at images that are represented as pixels. We're looking at art, we're looking at text, we're looking at movies, which is basically sets of images over time. But there is so much more that could be understood as cultural analysis. And in some sense, it becomes this cartoon image. It becomes this thing where people quarry with each other. Should it be called cultural analytics, cultural data analytics, cultural analysis? I don't care, I couldn't care less. It's the same as digital humanities, computing, computational humanities, whatever. It's always like somebody trying to get a faculty position. But I think that is exactly the point. Like, how do we sort of like preserve this sort of swarm of things that are similar and give people the opportunity to find each other? Like, people that are similar to you should find you so you can find them and stuff like that. So that's sort of the purpose. And the key thing is like we're enzymatic in that sense. Like this is sort of something I repeated since 2020. Ideally, I'm not burned, which, humans are not enzymes, they burn out. But so there's this sort of like, it is something that needs to live in not just one space, basically. Because, we're in Estonia, it's really hard to fund this, basically. This is an interesting question. So people will be more specialized over time, but we had this chance to do this, and I think that is sort of like a message for everybody. Like whenever you have the chance to do multidisciplinary encounters, even though it may seem completely useless, it's not true. It's actually sort of like super enriching and beneficial, which I guess, the place where you are is nominally an art history institute, but we all know there's a whole crowd of people that are sort of multidisciplinary. That is also one of these places, and I think that is sort of like also cool. So it in a sense, it would be great to have a map of this, to allow people to find it and not just stumble into it in the same way they go on holiday on a place, right, for some reason and not another, basically. So that would be sort of like my desire for the future. But thank you very much. This was great. We learned a lot. And it was really a great pleasure to see this work folding out. In some sense, starting where I stopped off of my PhD, which is sort of great. And so, we're just links in a journey, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
That's really